Welcome to the wonderful world of wine, exploring all things wine with you. We are your hosts, Mark Lindsay and Kim Simone, and you can find us on Facebook at The Wonderful World of Wine. Hello and welcome to this week's installment of The Wonderful World of Wine. Following trending topics in the wine world, I am co-host Kim Simone here with my other co-host, Mark Lindsay. How are you this week, Mark?
Hey, Kim.
Hey.
The partner in wine crime.
Partner in wine crime. That's right.
We haven't used that in a while.
And we love talking wine every week with you, our listeners. And as we move into the spring, it's always nice to kind of shake things up a little bit, maybe do a little science, maybe do a little marketing stuff like we talked about last week when we were talking about supermarket wines and how to find the best value. Our first article for today is an article that I don't know, kind of rubbed me a little bit the wrong way at the very beginning of it. And it's,
I like that. I like when there's controversy on the show.
That's right.
I like that.
So it's another article from Wine Enthusiast, which does some really decent wine writing about some mostly basic topics. But they started this article that was called, "Is This Wine Any Good? The 5 Most Important Structural Components to Know." And the start of this, I'm like, is this wine any good? Okay, so we're going to read about what to look for to tell you if this is a good wine or not. But I don't feel like the structure of a wine necessarily tells you if it's a good wine or not. And they finally, at the end of the article, got to the topic of balance and complexity to tell you if your wine is good. But I was a little dismayed at the beginning because I'm like, well, the structure, insofar as it's the structure of the wine, doesn't really tell you whether it's good or bad.
See,
and I'm interested to hear your take on that.
Well, of course, I didn't agree. I thought they did say what is a good wine. That's how they start, like you said. But then they did say a good wine should be what you think is a good wine before they talked about these 5 structural components. And like you said, then they drew you in, went through the 5 structural components, and at the end said a good wine is a balance of all of these. So to me, it was good writing because it drew me into saying something kind of to get you, what do you mean? You're going to tell me the trick of what's good, right? How can I tell people this is a good wine based on what? And then it gave you some technical stuff. And then it just said, yeah, but it has to be a balance to be considered good. But I don't know, Kim, I don't think it was anything deceiving. It went right away and said, which we always tell people, good is what you think is good. And does it really matter if these 5 things, you don't like it and I do? You like one thing on the list and someone else likes another thing on the list of the 5 components. So I didn't really have a problem.
For me, it was more the title.
Yeah. No, I can understand that.
Like if the title had been slightly different.
Yeah. Because
I felt like the article itself, even at the very beginning, they were very upfront about, let's talk about the structural element, then see, this is a quality wine. But I was just a little bit, I don't know.
Yeah. How you
perturbed.
Wine is good. Yeah.
The title of the article.
Yeah.
Because you can have wines with very, very different types of structure that are equally good quality. Like there's always a back and forth about, is wine that is dry versus a wine that is sweet any better? And I think we were talking a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about ratings and the 100-point system. And one of the systems that you use where, you give different numbers for different structural elements. And it's like, well, if someone is going to give a lower score to a wine with sweetness because sweetness is counted as a negative, or wines with maybe a little bit more aggressive acidity is considered a negative, it's like, as long as everything is in balance, it should be a positive. But taking the individual elements and putting like a dry wine up against a sweet wine, or a higher acid wine versus a lower, or lower tannins versus higher tannins, you can have a lower tannin red wine that is still just as equally good to a wine that has really structured tannins. So they can be different, but they can still all be good quality.
Yeah, well, you mentioned sweetness, so, and that is one of the 5 structural components they talked about. So let's start with that. And I like the way you were going with that, because you can have, and they mentioned it in this article, you can have sweetness in a wine. It doesn't mean it's fruity. It's a fruity wine. It has to do with the sugar, what's left in the wine after fermentation. So you might like sweet wines and think it's a good wine, and I might find it too sweet. And for that reason, I say it's not a good wine. So I think that's where you were kind of going on the components, saying good or not good. And that can be with any of these 5 things. But sweetness, you have to have a good balance of sweetness too, if it's technically not a sweet wine. And there's levels of sugar where people can find it really overpowering. So I thought that was a good one to start with. Did you think that was, of the components they went through, do you think sweetness was good to start with?
Yeah, I think it's good to start with. I think it's a little bit harder with sweetness because you generally only find wines that are regarded very well, if they're sweet wines, as these really high octane, not octane, but really sweet desserty wines. So we're talking about Sauterne and Port and some of the sweeter sherries and Tokaj. We're not necessarily talking about an everyday kind of wine to drink that has some sweetness to it. You know, we're talking about legit lots and lots of sugar, definitely either for dessert or for pairing with something super duper fatty, but they're not everyday drinking wines. I think that's what I want to get, I guess, across about the sweetness part, is that usually when we're talking about quality wines, we're not talking about wines that are a little bit sweet for everyday drinking. And that's kind of what I think one of the annoying things about using sugar as one of these components is that we could have a perfectly pleasant to drink wine that has some sweetness to it, but it's not usually going to get high points because those wines also tend to be kind of mass produced or more for, I think, a broader market of people who maybe are just learning to like wine or just starting to get into wine. So the sweet wines that we're talking about that tend to get these higher scores tend to be very sweet, but also very balanced. So it's, I think, difficult to talk about sugar in wine as a balanced wine because they can be not the wines that a lot of drinkers are familiar with.
And that's a good lead into the next structural component. They talked about acid. So a lot of times the acidity can balance some of that overpoweringness of.
And it should. It absolutely
Correct.
should. So like if you have a bottle of Sauterne that doesn't have enough acidity to it, it's just going to taste sweet. And I feel what makes a dessert wine really good is that it does have that balance of acidity to it. So it's not just cloying. It's got some refreshingness to it as well. Is refreshingness a word? I don't think so.
Sounds good to me.
There we go.
So they mentioned the acidity makes up 1% of wine.
I'm surprised it's that low.
Yeah, I that's where I was going with that, because
Yeah.
they said most of wine is component is water, but 1% makes up wine. And I've never really seen it that.
Yeah, I don't. We tend to look
breakdown.
at like, okay, what's the water content, right? What's the alcohol content?
Right.
And then it's always like 2% of other,
Yeah.
but I don't know that I've ever
1%
seen
acids.
acidity broken down as a percentage of the wine. I thought that was interesting.
And then you will lead into the next one. You said alcohol. So we'll talk about that as another structural component, which a lot of times is it should be hard to detect unless there's something that's out of balance, like they were saying. Then it tends to be all you taste is alcohol.
Mhm.
But usually most wines are it doesn't overpower. The alcohol shouldn't overpower the wine. And you
Right.
don't see it too often.
Yeah, you're right. And that's, I think, is the great point, is that it shouldn't overwhelm. Like the alcohol in your wine doesn't just add the booziness to it. It also adds a little bit of sweetness, and it also adds body, and it also adds weight. So there are all of these things that alcohol contributes to in your glass of wine beyond just the taste of, oh, this tastes like I'm drinking alcohol. The issue is when it is out of balance with those other things. So it's not necessarily always the number on the bottle. So you can have a wine that's 12% that you can literally taste the alcohol in because it might be out of balance with all those other components, whether it be the sweetness, whether it be the acidity, whether it be just the otherwise body of the wine. Like if you have a really light Pinot Grigio that's 12%, but you can taste that it's boozy, that is out of balance. Whereas there are other wines that might be 15%, but because they have so much more going on with them, they have tannins, they have structure, they have viscosity, they've got other components, might taste completely harmoniously in balance. And you won't taste that alcohol at all, even though it is a few points higher than that other wine. So I think that alcohol is actually one of the things that I am most sensitive to in an unbalanced wine. So it's an important component. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think lately for me, it's been, you see these wines that are higher, but they, like you said, they taste so imbalanced that you don't even know that you're drinking 1% or 2% higher alcohol because they're doing such a good job making the wine and balancing it out. And then you worked right into the next structural component. They talked about body, saying alcohol gives body. And we've talked about this a lot where we say the weight of the wine and we try to put it in reference to milk or water weight type of things. I can't think of an instance where I would say the wine is it's just too heavy, but everything else, it's off because of the weight.
Yeah. I don't know that I would necessarily put body in with these structural elements. Like, yes, it's there, but it's made up of the other things that are on this list. So the body of the wine comes from the alcohol. It comes from the tannic structure.
The only thing I can use an example of this, Kim, is a lot, and Pinot Grigio, I could say that was like water. I mean, that was just so light. I got nothing out of it. So never on the heavy side, more on the light side. Like it's too light.
Yeah.
Would throw it off.
So it's not balanced because it's too light for you.
Just too light.
And maybe that's why there are very, very few 100-point Pinot Grigios, if any.
On my scale. Yeah.
Yep.
And then the last structural component is tannins. So tannin, Kim, what something is too tannic throws off the balance, but it could also mean at that time that it's just a young wine that could be
absolutely
beautiful over time.
This is another one that is in the eye of the beholder. Some people prefer more tannic wines. Some people maybe like wines that don't quite have a lot of the tannic dryness that some wines do have. Think about things like Barbaresco and Barolo and Bordeaux. These are wines that, like you mentioned, definitely in their youth can come across as that's all that you're tasting or that's all that you're feeling. And I think for certain wines, that having that tannic structure can get in the way of the flavors. And it's sometimes difficult to assess, is this a good wine right now? Is this a good wine in the future for those wines that have too much tannins? But I kind of feel like something like oak should also come to play in this, because these are all what I call the textural elements of wine. And even if all of these things are in balance, if the flavors are out of balance, then it can also make you rethink whether this is a good quality, well-balanced wine. But we're not talking about flavors, only talking about textures. But I agree that tannins, and if they're well-balanced tannins, and what you're expecting out of them as well. So you wouldn't expect that a Pinot Noir would have really aggressive, super full-bodied tannins. That would be considered not necessarily the best quality Pinot Noir. And then vice versa for a Cabernet. If your Cabernet doesn't have a lot of tannic structure, then you're going to think, well, this is kind of a wimpy Cabernet.
So we talked about all 5 of the structural components. They were saying, wine enthusiasts, of all of those, Kim, what is the hardest for you to relate to if someone's asking you or describing a wine to you of their level of these 5? And I'll give you my example. For me, if someone tells me something is sweet, right, to your sweetness and my sweetness, I've had it a million times where someone say, oh, I think that wine is sweet, or it's not, mostly the other way. That's not sweet at all. And I'm like, oh my God, that has so much residual sugar in there.
Yeah.
So of all those, I think that to me is harder to relate with someone's profile.
I think that is like a legitimate physiological difference between human beings, is that some of us taste things and we really can be really impacted by the sweetness and by the sugar. Some people have low thresholds, some people have high thresholds for sweetness. So I think that that is a really difficult thing to talk about. Some people love to eat Oreos and some people can't eat Oreos because they're just too sweet for them.
As far as detection of all of these, sweetnesses would be the hardest for people to be on the same
I think for discussion, acidity can be hard to get across to people, and not so much because it's what you like, what you don't like, but because I feel like it's a topic that we don't often talk about outside of wine. Like there's not a lot besides like citrus fruit, we don't tend to talk about acidity in a positive kind of way. Like people know vinegar and they know like lemon juice. But other than that, I don't think we tend to talk about acidity in foods unless you're in the kitchen and you're trying to make a meal or trying to make a dish and perfectly balance all of that. So I think that that's another one that maybe just from lack of exposure and lack of conversation.
It's the scariest on the list for sure.
It's absolutely scary.
For
talking about, this is a high acid wine. You're like, why would I want to drink that if it's a high acid wine? I'm like, no, that's a good thing.
Yeah. You're listening to The Wonderful World of Wine. We are your hosts, Mark Lindsay and Kim Simone, exploring all things wine with you. For more information about Kim, please go to her website at commonwealthwineschool.com. For more information about myself, please go to franklinliquors.com. We are here every week on Franklin Radio, WFPR 102.9 FM. You can find our past episodes on SoundCloud or iTunes. You can also find us now on Twitter at Wine Education and on Instagram at The Wonderful World of Wine. Now we want to talk about a food article, Kim. Actually, there was two kind of articles I want to combine in. We can talk about. One is when a wine is food friendly. What does that mean? And that was in the Globe and Mail publication. And then I want to follow up with, because it's that time of year, we're getting towards steak season, and Tasting Table had what is the best wine with steak? And I think they were related. And I want to start with food friendly. We hear this term all the time, Kim. I probably abuse it too many times. And I wanted to get your definition of when you say a wine is food friendly and compared to what I think or how I use it.
So my idea of what do I mean when I say a wine is food friendly is that it has certain components to it that play off of food a little bit better than if the wine were to be consumed on its own. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not good to drink on its own, nor that other wines that I wouldn't describe as food friendly would be bad with food. It's more that there are personality traits, shall we say, in that particular wine that it will taste better with certain foods than it will on its own. So that's kind of my basic definition of what's a food-friendly wine.
I think we're on the same page with that. And I would
assume so.
The one thing I have to define, though, is when you taste that wine, you say, this would go good with food. But I don't see myself sitting down tonight on the couch, just pouring a glass of this and drinking it. Is that because it is not your typical style wine that you like, but you would deal with it or you could put up with it if it was paired with a food to complement it? Is that how you look at that?
No, not really. Because I have favorite wines that are my sipping wines. And then I have favorite wines that I like to put with a meal. So there are certain styles that I won't.
Those meal ones, would you pass those out? The ones you have that are just, you feel like better food wines, would you pass those out to people to just sip on?
Maybe not, honestly. Something like a dry Riesling. Like I have certain meals, certain dishes that I will almost always pair with dry Riesling, but it's not something that I necessarily like to just have a glass of.
Yeah. That's interesting though. Yeah. It's interesting though, because that's a great example, because there's certain styles of Riesling that I would not sell to someone without saying you have to really get the most out of this wine, you have to pair it with this to make it really shine, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And as a retailer, it's tough to get wines like that because
Yeah.
not everybody's going to eat a certain food that they have to pair that with, you know, and
Right.
I don't want them to buy it and not pair it with something and not get the best out of it.
Yep.
I think
So there
we-
are certain things like that. And then there are also certain wines that I would not necessarily feel like, well, I need to have this with food. So something that's big and fruity and maybe powerful and maybe has a lot of tannins. Like I very rarely will put California Zinfandel with food. And I know that there are some that will go with particular foods, whether it be stew or steak, like we'll talk about in a few minutes. But Zin is one of those things that I'm like, if I just want to have a glass of red wine, that's what I'm going to pour for myself.
Yeah. Well, everybody has their go-to. And I liked how they said many cultures in the world think wine is food.
Is food. Yep.
Right. So, I mean,
in my house, wine is food.
Yeah.
I choose what we're going to drink based on what we're having for dinner.
And I think
sometimes the reverse. Sometimes I'll make dinner with the one, like maybe the one bottle of wine that I have cold in the fridge. So what am I making for dinner?
Isn't that a great thing though, that it's respected like that? I mean, take Italy. It's had probably the best example, right? I mean, they so enjoy wine with everything for food, right? And every area has its wines that they grow because it goes with the food.
But they're so flexible too. Like there's just like house wine that we're not really sure. You know, we don't care what necessarily what the blend is. We just, you know, it's what you drink with lunch.
Yeah.
And it's beautiful. And it goes with your pasta. So
yeah, and it's just I'm glad we're on the same page about food. So you don't really hear someone just try to sell you something, say it's food friendly wine. Every wine is food friendly in some way. There's always some dish that's going to pair this. That's
a good point. That's a really good point. That everything has a positive to it. That you can, with any wine out there, you can find something to pair with it.
You could
even
say it
if
with
it's
any
just, you know, who knows.
Yeah, I mean, you could say that with any wine, that it's food friendly with something. But there are certain ones where it really, like you said, with your Riesling, I have go-tos. I say you have to. And when I'm tasting, I'm like, I have to promote this. And then my note, if I'm saying it goes with a certain food, that's because when I tasted it, that's what, you know, I think it should go with. And that's the really I feel a helpful tip if someone's telling you what you should pair it with. So you mentioned the steak article, Tasting Table. We always talk about protein and what to match up with high protein and foods. And steak is got to be the go-to. I'm the meat and potatoes guy, steak guy. What do you want to start with on this topic, Kim? Advice for our listeners.
So what I liked about this article was that, so first of all, they give oodles of ideas for what wines to eat with steak. It wasn't just like steak and here are the two wines that you need to pair with it. They gave like 10 different types of wine that can go with it.
Right.
But I like that they touched on the fact of fat and that the cut of your steak can have an impact on how well it goes with the wine that you choose. So they did talk a bit about if you have a fattier cut, you want to go this direction. If you have a leaner cut, you want to go in this direction. They didn't talk an awful lot about cooking methods, did they?
They just mentioned if it was broiled or grilled, like the cooking method.
Yeah. But they didn't go into like, if you have a pot roast, you want to do this, or if you have a steak on the grill, or if you made stew, like that kind of thing, which adds a whole nother dimension and element to the pairing.
But the view on the fattiness, I thought was really,
I thought that was brilliant. It was really smart because it does make a difference. If you have filet mignon that doesn't have a lot of fattiness to it, it's very tender, it's very lean, and the flavor is milder than if you have, you know, something that is more marbled and that, you know, you've put on the grill and it's all like all that. Oh, I'm getting hungry again. All that fattiness has seeped into the meat. You want a milder wine with that filet because a big honkin' California Cabernet that's full of oak and is full of tannins is really going to overpower that poor little filet mignon.
Yeah, there was more concentration on the fattiness versus toppings or sauces or
rubs
spices.
Or like, that kind of thing.
I like that they mentioned like dry aged steaks.
That was interesting. I thought that was very interesting too.
And so let's start with that. The dry aged, I thought what did they want? They said Nebbiolo to pair with the dry aged steak. And I thought that was just like the perfect suggestion. I've
Yeah.
never,
But they said an aged Nebbiolo. So you're doing like you're aging your meat and you're aging your wine. So you have these extra umami elements to both the meat and the wine that I think those are the flavor compounds that they're working to play off of each other.
So like a Barolo or a Barbaresco or something like that. So, and you mentioned previously, you talked about Zinfandel. Did you agree they mentioned Zinfandel here to pair it with grilled meat?
I would usually do, although I tend to do Zin with barbecue because I feel like some Zinfandels get on that jammy end of the flavor profile. So something with a barbecue sauce. So like I tend to do Zinfandel with like steak tips if I've got steak tips that have like barbecue sauce on them. Right. So that's where I would do the Zin.
That's where I was figuring they were going with grilled meat, was barbecue meat. I also love the suggestion. You mentioned filet, right? And I've never paired a filet with Malbec. And they said Malbec with filet or a burger. And it made sense. A softer, less fatty Malbec is, I think, perfect for that, with the
Malbec,
filet.
Malbec and burgers are really good.
Burgers I've had, but I've never had it with the filet. I've always
never
gone that traditional cab route.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's so many Malbecs that have like a more blueberry than a blackberry fruit. Yeah. And I think that's could be so good especially with some of the glazes they put on fillets.
I think one of the takeaways from this article is that there's so much wiggle room. There's so much that you can do. It's almost like there's not a bad combination. There might be combos that are better than others, but any red wine that has some sort of tannin to it with practically any cut of beef, you're probably going to be good. Sometimes is not what our listeners want to hear because you want a little bit more direction. But I think that it should be a bit of a freeing feeling in that you're not going to mess it up.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I love that they threw some Portuguese wine in this article as well, because there are some really beautiful things out of Portugal, especially red wines, that are still not really on people's radars because they are unusual. And, they're from places that we don't know of, and they're grape varieties that we don't know of, and appellations that we've never heard of before. But when you just open the bottles and taste the wines, they taste familiar. They're really back to that food friendly thing. They're really, really great with practically anything you want to put them with.
Like you said, they mentioned so many different styles. I like that they mentioned Super Tuscans because I feel Sangiovese based Super Tuscans with an earthier topping on any type of grilled steak, I think is a perfect.
Throw some mushrooms on there. You're
exactly. Good. Oh yeah. No.
Sun-dried tomatoes.
Now I'm hungry. Now you have me hungry. And the thing that wasn't mentioned, I think I told you before, I like to marinate steak with port. And I think port, if you never tried taking a sip of port with a burger or a steak or any cut of meat like that, it really is interesting.
Port and a burger with blue cheese on it.
There you go.
And bacon.
See, that's why we hang out. Yeah, I could do that. And I'm not I'm not a daring blue cheese man, but if you give me a glass of port.
That'll be me. I've got the blue cheese on my burger.
I would splash it down with some port just to make you happy that I tried it. Thank you for joining us today on The Wonderful World of Wine. We've been your hosts, Mark Lindsay and Kim Simone, exploring all things wine with you. You can find us here every week on Franklin Radio, WFPR 102.9 FM. You can find us on Facebook at The Wonderful World of Wine. We'd like any questions or comments you may have. And you can find our past episodes on SoundCloud and iTunes. Cheers.